August 12, 1944, 5:37 in the morning. The air over Normandy hung thick with fog and the acrid smell of diesel smoke. Inside the M4 Sherman tank designated Cobra, Corporal Jack Harrison gripped the control levers with both hands, his knuckles white, his palms slick with sweat. Through the narrow driver's viewport, he could barely see 20 yards ahead. The ground looked wrong, too smooth, too flat, like someone had swept it clean and then tried to make it look natural again. The radio crackled. Engineers hadn't cleared this stretch yet. Protocol was simple: stop, wait, report. But Jack looked at the soft earth ahead, at the 4 tanks lined up behind him, at the narrow window of time they had before German artillery found their position. And something inside him said no. Not this time. He eased the throttle forward. The Sherman lurched. Then came the crunch. Soft, metallic, unmistakable. Something beneath the left tread had been triggered. Jack didn't stop. Instead, he did the unthinkable. He shifted the tank's weight, angled the treads, and slid 40 tons of American steel sideways across a minefield. Not like a race car, not dramatic. Just enough to redistribute pressure, to glide over death instead of crushing into it. Behind him, 4 more Shermans watched in stunned silence. If he stopped now, they'd all stop. The advance would stall. They'd be sitting ducks. But Jack didn't stop. He drifted. And somehow, impossibly, they lived. Before we go any further, a quick moment. Whether you're watching from Texas or Tokyo, Berlin or Buenos Aires, you're part of something rare, a global community that refuses to let these stories fade. If this kind of history matters to you, hit that like button and subscribe. It keeps these voices alive. Now, let's continue. After D-Day, June 6, 1944, the war in Western Europe entered a grinding, brutal phase. The beaches had been taken, but Normandy itself became a killing field. The hedgerows, the bocage, ancient farm boundaries made of earth and root, turned every field into a natural fortress. Roads were narrow, bridges were rigged, and the ground was full of mines. The Germans had planted an estimated 3 million anti-tank and anti-personnel mines across Normandy alone. 3 million hidden killers, each one waiting for pressure, heat, vibration. Anything that said, detonate. To counter this, the Allies deployed specialized mine-clearing units, flail tanks with rotating chains that beat the ground ahead, and combat engineers with metal detectors and steady hands. But those units were few, stretched thin, and often delayed, so frontline armor sometimes had to roll forward with no guarantee the path was safe. No flails, no engineers, just instinct and prayer. That was the situation on August 12, 1944. The mission was part of a larger breakout operation, pushing east from the Caen sector toward the town of Falaise. Speed was everything. Every hour the Germans held the roads. They could reinforce, retreat, regroup. The Allied objective was to punch through before the enemy could close the gap. Jack Harrison was 24 years old. Red-haired, lean, with the calloused hands of someone who'd grown up fixing tractors on an Iowa farm. He'd volunteered for the Army in 1942, right after his older brother was killed in North Africa. Trained as a tank driver at Fort Knox, Kentucky. Had a gift for machines, a taste for risk. By the summer of 1944, he was the primary driver of Cobra, an M4 Sherman assigned to a forward armored platoon. His crew included Sergeant Ray Morales, the loader, Corporal Dennis Lee, the gunner, and Private Ed Bailey, the assistant driver. Just 19 years old, scared but steady. At 4:30 that morning, before first light, the platoon received orders. Advance 5 kilometers northeast. Secure a crossroads. Hold until infantry support arrived. Intelligence warned of German mines and possible rearguard snipers. The engineers weren't ready. The flail tanks were delayed. so the platoon would go in without mine-clearing support. Standard procedure in this situation was clear. At the first sign of a minefield, stop. Do not proceed. Call for support. Wait. But war doesn't care about procedures. War moves on its own time. And sometimes, waiting gets you killed. Jack's Sherman led the formation. Behind him, 4 other tanks: Viper, Rattler, Sidewinder, Copperhead. Each spaced roughly 100 feet apart, enough distance to avoid a chain reaction if one hit a mine. The air was heavy with morning mist. Visibility maybe 30 yards at best. The soil was damp from overnight rain. Jack's view through the periscope was a tunnel of gray shapes and shadows. But as the tank crawled forward at 5 miles per hour, his gut told him something was off. The ground ahead looked disturbed. No roots, no rocks. Just a smooth patch of brown dirt, with faint discoloration along the edges. It wasn't much, but it was enough. Jack keyed the radio. Possible minefield ahead. Proceeding with caution. The platoon commander's voice came back, clipped and tense. Hold position. Wait for engineers. Jack didn't reply. Not because he didn't hear, but because he was thinking. He turned to Bailey, seated to his right. You see that patch? Bailey nodded. Yeah, looks wrong. We stoppin'? Jack shook his head slowly. No. If we stop here, the whole column stops. Then we're targets. Bailey stared at him. What are you saying? Jack's voice was calm. I'm saying I can slide this thing across that patch, shift the weight, cut the traction just enough to roll over it without setting it off. Bailey's eyes widened. That's not in the manual. Jack grinned, just barely. Neither was Normandy. He looked at the instrument panel. Fuel good. Oil pressure steady. Treads responding. He adjusted the throttle, changed the gear ratio, angled the treads slightly to the right. This wasn't a stunt. This was physics. By transferring the tank's weight diagonally, by angling the massive treads away from the direct pressure zones, Jack believed he could cross without triggering a full detonation. It was a theory, a gamble, but it was all he had. He checked the clock on the dash. 5:36 and 40 seconds. He muttered under his breath. Okay, Red, time to dance. The Sherman rumbled forward. Jack's hands were steady now, focused. The mist outside hadn't lifted. The soil ahead looked dry but hollow, like a crust hiding something underneath. Behind him, the other tanks idled, watching, waiting. Their commanders assumed Jack would stop. The column was too close to enemy artillery range to sit still for long, but no one wanted to be first to die in a minefield. Inside Cobra, Bailey whispered, "Still time to pull back." Jack didn't answer. Instead, he eased off the throttle, then nudged it gently again, just enough to feel the weight shift. The tank's massive body leaned slightly right, nudging the treads to grip more of the firmer ground along the edge. It wasn't dramatic. It was subtle, calculated. Jack remembered something an old mechanic told him back in Kentucky. You don't steer a tank with brute strength. You steer it with balance. He adjusted again. Left tread throttled back. Right tread pushed gently forward. The 40-ton machine began to pivot. Not a full turn, not a spin, just a subtle lateral slide. Maybe 5 degrees. Just enough to shift pressure away from dead center. 5:37. That's when it happened. A sudden crunch beneath the forward tread. Louder than a stick. Softer than a full blast. Like metal teeth biting into metal. Bailey flinched. We hit one. The tank lurched slightly, a hiccup in its movement. But it kept moving. No explosion. Jack's hands froze, then gripped tighter. His foot hovered above the brake, but Cobra rolled forward. 2 more feet, then 3. The entire tread section cleared the soft patch. Jack gave it gas. And just like that, the Sherman had crossed what every manual said was impassable. Not by luck, Not by brute force, by feel. Behind him the radio crackled. Lieutenant Morris's voice came through, sharp and tight. "Cobra, report. We saw movement. Did you just cross that?" Jack pressed the mic button. "Negative detonation. Cobra is mobile. Field may be soft but passable. Recommend same tread path." Silence. Then, "Copy that. Rattler, follow Cobra's exact track." A second tank engine roared to life. Jack exhaled. Not relief. Not yet. He leaned toward the viewport and looked back. Rattler followed perfectly. Tread over tread. The second Sherman traced the same arc. Another crunch. Another hesitation. But again, no explosion. Bailey murmured, "You're out of your mind, Jack." Jack replied quietly, "I'd rather be insane and alive than careful and dead." They advanced another 20 yards before slowing. The suspected minefield lay behind them now. Jack halted the tank just long enough to look over the area they'd crossed. The dirt showed signs of disturbance. Several small metal discs glinted where the soil had cracked slightly. Mines. Definitely real. They hadn't imagined it. Corporal Lee, the gunner, spoke up for the first time that morning. "You just made a minefield a road." Jack turned toward the crew. "No, I made it a bet. We just got lucky." But it wasn't luck. Not entirely. The maneuver Jack had executed was risky, yes, but not reckless. By shifting the tank's weight off the pressure points and using the side slope to his advantage, he had minimized downward force on the mines. The Sherman's lower ground pressure, thanks to its wider treads compared to German armor, helped too. Still, it was a roll of the dice. Any mine with a tilt fuse or magnetic trigger could have detonated anyway. But most German Teller mines and S-mines required direct weight, often more than 300 pounds per square inch concentrated above them. Cobra had danced just enough to avoid that threshold. 3 more tanks followed behind, one by one, carefully mimicking Jack's route. The trail was now visible, a thin groove in the damp earth. No one spoke. No one breathed loudly. Each tank paused briefly before entering the zone. Each one made it through. By 5:43, the entire platoon had crossed the minefield. 0 casualties, 0 delays, 5 tanks across what should have been a death trap. Lieutenant Morris's voice came through again, this time more relaxed. "Cobra, what's your status?" Jack replied. "Mobile, tracks intact, no visible damage." There was a pause. Then Morris said, "That was insane." Jack smiled faintly. "Insane and effective, sir." Over the radio net, someone chuckled. Tension released like air from a valve. Morales, the loader, banged the inside of the turret twice. "You better patent that move, Red." Bailey nodded slowly. "Tank sliding across a minefield. Never saw that in basic." Jack sat back, gripping the controls lightly. "Neither did I, but sometimes the manual gets you killed." From a technical standpoint, what Jack had done would later be described in a post-war training report as a lateral weight drift. But at the time, it had no name, just instinct. It was the kind of move that never gets taught because it shouldn't work. But on that day, with fog in the air, wet soil under the treads, and German defenses watching from the tree line, it was the only move that made sense. What's more, Jack's decision didn't just save his crew. It saved time. By getting through the minefield without delay, the platoon maintained momentum. Behind them, the rest of the armored battalion was able to advance without getting backed up or rerouted. In war, minutes matter. An unexpected delay of even 15 minutes can mean the difference between flanking an enemy position or running headfirst into their guns. Jack's gamble had bought them those minutes, and no one died for it. Later that afternoon, combat engineers swept the area and confirmed it. Over 12 anti-tank mines had been buried across the 75-yard stretch. Most were live. Some had been triggered but failed to detonate, probably due to moisture or corrosion. One had clearly cracked, its pressure plate bent but unexploded. It wasn't a miracle. It was daring, calculation, and a little bit of Iowa farm boy nerve. The kind of nerve that comes from growing up in a place where, if the tractor broke down during harvest, you didn't wait for a mechanic. You fixed it yourself. You figured it out. You moved forward. Because stopping meant losing the crop, and losing the crop meant everything. By 5:45 in the morning, the entire platoon had regrouped on the far side of the field. 5 Sherman tanks intact, engines humming, crews breathing again. The air still smelled like damp earth and diesel. The sun was breaking through the clouds now, thin shafts of light cutting across the broken French countryside. Lieutenant Morris called for a short halt to recheck formation. Radio silence was maintained beyond essential chatter, in case the Germans were listening. But inside the turret of Cobra, the mood had shifted. Bailey was still staring at the field they'd crossed. "You know," he said softly, "my training officer back at camp said a minefield was a guaranteed death sentence. No exceptions." Jack glanced over. "Then I guess we just became the exception." The other tanks held position in a staggered formation behind them. Crewmen peeked from hatches, nodding toward Cobra with looks of disbelief and admiration. They had seen it. They wouldn't forget it. By 6 o'clock, the battalion commander ordered the column forward. Jack's platoon pushed ahead another kilometer, securing a small intersection near a hamlet the maps called Saint-Lambert. No German resistance was encountered, only abandoned defensive positions and scattered debris. But the most important result wasn't what they captured. It was what they prevented. Had the platoon been delayed at the minefield, had Jack stopped as ordered, the entire forward push would have stalled. At least 10 tanks and 2 infantry companies would have bunched up behind them, exposed in open terrain. According to post-action reports, a German artillery battery had been repositioning just 2 kilometers north. Had the Americans remained static for more than 20 minutes, they would have likely come under heavy fire. Instead, they were gone by the time the German spotters arrived. One captain later wrote in his journal, "The speed of movement through the kill zone is what saved us. One tank made the call. The rest followed. We owe that driver more than he knows." In military terms, Jack's maneuver preserved what commanders call tempo. Tempo is everything in offensive warfare. The faster you move, the less time the enemy has to react. Break that rhythm, and you risk collapse. By holding tempo, the platoon allowed the rest of the armored battalion to bypass the minefield entirely. They used the same tread path laid down by Jack and his crew. Engineers marked it later with colored flags. They called it Cobra Lane. It became a temporary lifeline through that sector for nearly 12 hours, until the front shifted further east. Back at battalion command, word of the incident spread quickly. Lieutenant Morris was summoned for questioning. Not reprimand, just clarification. His superior asked if Jack had disobeyed a direct order. Morris, to his credit, gave a carefully worded answer. "No, sir. He did not proceed against orders. He proceeded before I gave one." It was enough to satisfy protocol. But the truth was more complicated. Privately, Morris approached Jack later that evening. "You know you scared the hell out of me, right?" Jack just nodded. "Sir, I figured if I stopped, we'd lose the window." Morris looked at him for a long moment. "Next time, you clear it with me first." Then, after a pause, he added quietly, "But between us, that was the ballsiest move I've seen in this war. There was no medal, no commendation. Not that day, not that week." Jack's actions were filed into the after-action logs with neutral language. Tank driver initiated forward momentum through suspected field using alternate tread path. Platoon followed safely. It wasn't the kind of sentence that stood out. Not without context. But to the men in the platoon, it meant everything. Morales, the loader, later wrote in his journal, "We would have stopped. I would have told my own brother to stop, but Red kept going. I still don't know how he knew. Maybe he didn't. Maybe he just believed." Cobra wasn't undamaged. During the crossing, the left tread had bent slightly. The suspension took a hit. After action, mechanics had to replace a track section and realign the turret rotation gears. But the tank kept running through the rest of August. Later that month, during the closing of the Falaise pocket, the platoon helped intercept retreating German forces. And Cobra was there, still grinding forward, its engine now with a slight rattle from the Minefield stunt. Word spread informally through the division. Tank crews from other battalions began asking, "Is this the unit with the guy who drifted a Sherman?" Someone started calling Jack Slide, short for Tank Slide. The nickname stuck for a few days, then faded. Because Jack didn't talk about it. When asked, he'd shrug and say, "We didn't have time to stop." But those 10 minutes between 5:37 and 5:47 in the morning changed more than a platoon's fate. They changed the course of a day's offensive. The next morning, a recon unit passed through the same area. They reported fresh shell craters behind the minefield. German artillery had fired at the original staging position, 20 minutes too late. Had the column bunched up, at least 3 vehicles could have been lost. The men inside would have died, or worse, been captured. All because one tank didn't stop. From a purely statistical standpoint, Jack's decision defied the odds. Most military analysts will tell you, don't ever move across a suspected minefield without clearance. The risk is too high. The variable's too unstable. And yet that day, with no special equipment, no clearance, and no backup, one man made a call. One man executed a maneuver that had never been trained, never been taught, never been advised. Because war is never about manuals. War is about moments. It's about people who, for reasons they often can't explain, decide to act. That minefield wasn't just dirt and death. It was a test, and Jack Harrison passed it. Not because he was lucky, but because he was willing to be first. Willing to trust his gut. Willing to roll forward when everyone else would have stopped. In the end, maybe that's what separates survivors from statistics. Not strength, not speed. Just a sense of timing and the courage to move when it matters most. In the days that followed, the war moved on as it always does. The front shifted, maps changed, towns fell, names were added to casualty lists, while others were erased from memory. The field that Jack Harrison had crossed, the patch of dirt that nearly killed him, was plowed under by an Allied bulldozer within 48 hours. No marker, no flag, no mention in official communiques. But to the men who had followed his tread path, it was sacred ground. After the Falaise Gap closed, the platoon continued advancing east. They crossed into Belgium by September, into Germany before winter. Cobra saw action at the Siegfried Line, but it was eventually replaced after mechanical failures too severe to repair in the field. Jack stayed with the unit until victory in Europe Day, May 8, 1945. Then he went home. No parade, no interview, no medals beyond the usual campaign ribbons. He returned to Iowa, to the same farm he'd left behind 3 years earlier. Married a schoolteacher. Raised 2 sons. Lived quietly. But what happened on that August morning never left him. He didn't talk about it often. Not because he was ashamed, but because he knew no one would quite understand. To most people it would sound like a mistake, a fluke, a soldier going off book. But to Jack, it wasn't about glory. It was about duty. In a letter to a former crewmate written in 1963, Jack said this: "They always ask if I was scared. I tell them of course I was. I was terrified. But I was more afraid of what would happen if we didn't move. We weren't just sitting on a tank. We were sitting on momentum. And once you lose momentum in war, it's like losing your footing on ice. You don't fall right away, but you fall." That word, momentum, became part of his legacy. Military tacticians later used the Cobra incident in training seminars, not as a model to repeat, but as a case study in battlefield adaptation. a footnote in a lecture on command flexibility. But the lesson wasn't just tactical. It was human, because what Jack did represented something bigger than a maneuver. It represented the idea that sometimes, in the most rigid and rule-bound environments, someone has to make a decision not based on orders, but on instinct. Someone has to feel the moment. Jack didn't have superior intel. He didn't have better tools. He had a sense of timing, a gut decision born from long days of mechanical intuition and the strange rhythm of war that only veterans know. And in that moment, he was right. But the real question is this: what if he hadn't been? What if that mine had detonated? What if Cobra had been blown sky high? He would have been blamed, maybe even posthumously court-martialed. His crew listed as casualties from unauthorized movement. The column would have halted anyway. Maybe more men would have died waiting for clearance. But he didn't die. And the lesson there is not just about courage, it's about responsibility. Jack once told his youngest son, when asked about the war, "It's not that I wasn't afraid of dying. I just didn't want to freeze in place because someone said wait. You can't wait your way to victory. Sometimes you have to move, even if the ground shakes." That line, "You can't wait your way to victory," became part of his family lore. And when Jack passed away in 1984, his son had it engraved on the back of his tombstone. He was buried in a quiet cemetery outside Cedar Rapids. No fanfare, no soldiers at attention. Just a folded flag and a handful of men from his old unit, now gray-haired and limping, who had driven across 3 states to be there. One of them brought a patch of earth wrapped in wax paper, soil from Normandy, from the approximate location of the Minefield. He placed it on Jack's grave and said quietly, "This is where you earned the rest of your life. Because not all legacies are carved in granite. Some are written in the decisions no one sees, the orders no one gives, the seconds that pass in silence when a single human being chooses motion over fear." War teaches us that no plan survives contact with the enemy. But Jack Harrison taught us something else, that no fear survives contact with purpose. And that is what makes his story unforgettable. Not because of a tank or a minefield or even a war, but because in one impossible moment, with nothing more than a steering lever and a heartbeat, he did what history so often forgets. He chose to move forward, not knowing if he'd make it, so that others behind him might never have to stop. Years passed, the war ended, nations rebuilt. Leaders gave speeches about peace and the future. Monuments rose to the generals, to the battles, to the flags planted on hilltops. But no monument ever stood where Jack Harrison drifted a Sherman tank across a minefield. And that's exactly why the story matters. Because history tends to magnify the loudest victories, the grand offensives, the surrender documents, the iconic photographs. But the real backbone of World War II wasn't made of steel or strategy. It was made of moments like this. Moments no camera captured, no reporter witnessed, no textbook ever mentions. Moments when a single man, buried in noise and confusion, made a decision that changed the fate of everyone behind him. Jack Harrison wasn't famous. He wasn't a hero by any formal measure. He never gave interviews or wrote a memoir. He returned home, fixed tractors again, and paid his bills on time. But for 10 seconds in a foggy field in Normandy, he held the lives of 4 other tanks in his hands. And instead of freezing, instead of waiting, instead of following procedure, he moved. Not for glory, not for orders, just because someone had to. And in that sense, Jack reminds us of something deeply uncomfortable but profoundly true. That leadership often comes down to proximity and pressure, not rank or ribbon. It comes down to who is there, who sees the danger first, and who decides not to pass it along, but to carry it. When we talk about courage, we usually imagine charging into fire or standing against overwhelming odds. But sometimes courage is quieter. Sometimes courage is just the refusal to stop, to feel fear and still press the pedal, to see the risk and still steer into it, not recklessly, but responsibly, with the understanding that doing nothing might cost more lives than doing something imperfect. Jack didn't defeat an army. He didn't change the outcome of the war. But he changed that day, and for the men who followed his tread path, that was enough. Let me pause here, not as a narrator, but as a person. Because when I first read this story, buried in an obscure oral history transcript from a reunion of veterans, I didn't believe it. It felt like a war myth, like something someone made up around a campfire. But the more I looked, the more pieces matched. Unit logs, engineering reports, personal letters, even a field map with a faint penciled-in note. Improvised lane, driver initiated. That was Jack. He improvised a lane through a minefield, not just in dirt, but in mindset. And maybe that's what we all need more of now. Not literal bravery in war, but the courage to move through fear. Because today, most of us will never face a German minefield. We'll never hear an artillery shell overhead or sit inside a 40-ton tank wondering if the ground beneath us will explode. But we all face our own kinds of frozen moments. Moments when the path ahead looks wrong. Moments when we're told to wait. Moments when no one else wants to go first. And in those moments, maybe we remember Jack Harrison. Not as a soldier, but as an example of action in uncertainty. Not action without thought. Not recklessness, but the kind of movement that comes from responsibility, from trust in your training, in your instincts, and in the people behind you. We live in a world where it's easy to freeze, to overthink, to stall out. But Jack teaches us that sometimes the right move is simply to move, not to guarantee success, but to break inertia. Because even a flawed step forward can open a path no one else saw. Because courage is contagious, and fear multiplies in silence. Because drifting isn't always a loss of control. Sometimes it's a form of mastery, of using what little control you have to guide yourself and others through what should be impossible. And because legacies, real ones, are not made of medals. They're made of moments, the kind no one sees, the kind you carry with you quietly. So if you take anything from this story, take this. Someone else might have the map, but you might be the one holding the wheel. And if the ground ahead looks dangerous, then maybe it's your turn to move. Not for glory, not for orders, but because someone has to lead. Even if only for 10 seconds. Even if no one remembers it but you. That's leadership. That's Jack Harrison. That's history written not in books, but in tracks across the mud.